it'll do what I want it to do. So, hi, I'm Denise Davidson, my co-host.
Oh, Mark Bauman.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
We're both faculty members at Bloomsburg University, and we're going to have there's a really little bit of information here on PowerPoint. But today, this particular session, which we're hoping will be really interactive, will address what we have seen and some pieces concerning language and how we use it in a general sense, but also in a college sense, college university settings, and within housing and residence life. So you can see the agenda on the left-hand side of your screen. You can all read, so I'm not going to read that to you. And you can see our learning outcomes on the right-hand side of the screen, left and right. And we are hoping to be able to work through all of this and to get to the point of us being able to have some things to sort of take back home with us. That's pretty much the extent of the PowerPoint. And one of the reasons that it is, I just like to share this with folks, one of the reasons that it is so sparse, that there are not a lot of bells and whistles with it, arise from some work that I've done and Mark has done as well, thinking about learning disabilities, and that a plain screen is often what's best for those who are experiencing learning disabilities. So I often don't do a lot of graphics and things like that. We want to talk a little bit about what's going on with language in our society. You know, we've certainly seen a lot of different opinions about Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. We've certainly seen controversies about athletic team mascots and how they're named, whether that's at the college level or pro sports level. So we're going to do that, but we're going to start with a game show. We're going to start with a little game show, get you involved and get you thinking. So we're going to give you a clue and then see if you can come up with what the answer is, right? And if you want to, if your technology allows, and if you don't have a lot of noise, background noise, we encourage you to unmute yourself actually, so that it's faster for you to participate. And we'll just sort of deal with any over talking that might happen. So here's your first clue. This phrase, with origins in the slave South, has come to mean a profound betrayal. It references a practice that started around 1808 after the importation of slaves from Africa to the US officially ended. Origins in the slave South, it's come to mean a profound betrayal. References a practice that started around 1808 after the importation of slaves from Africa to the US officially ended. Any ideas? The answer here is, ready? Ready for the answer? Everybody's ready. Sold down the river. Sold down the river. It comes from the practice of taking Black people to Louisville, Kentucky, to be sold down the Ohio River and transported to the cotton plantations in states that were further south. So that's sold down the river. And I should say here that these clues and answers come from the most excellent podcast, NPR's Code Switch. If you have not heard of that, I highly recommend it. They also have a weekly newsletter. I got today's today, or this week's today, and I recommend that as a way to stay connected if you feel that would be useful for you. So Mark has clue 2.
All right, clue number 2. This is a phrase used to describe someone shady who exploits an unsuspecting public. It started being used way back in the 1800s when Chinese immigrants came to the US to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Anyone know what that phrase is?
Is it a Huxler?
No. It's a good guess, though. I can't say that I know the origins of that particular term.
Is it black market?
No. Good. I like the ideas being thrown out there. Other When I share it, you're probably going to say, ah. Anyone else or want to venture something in the chat? Feel free if you want to take a go at it. So this is the term snake oil salesman. Snake oil salesman. I see the nonverbals, right? Oh, right. Have you heard this term out and about? Yes, a lot of head nodding. So this was a term that whose origins come from Chinese individuals, Chinese communities who in fact use the absolutely very legitimate medicine known as snake oil, which was made from the Chinese water snake, and it was used for centuries in Chinese culture, often relieving arthritis and other inflammation. So when these individuals came to the United States, they started sharing it with their American counterparts, and it sort of, you could, depending on your choice of language, you could say it either evolved or devolved into this sort of fraudulent claims later on down the line, where folks in this country started marketing things as cure-alls, kind of leaning on this snake oil legacy, if you will. And so they would put these tonics together and claim that these were, medicines for all ailments, and there were not any regulatory mechanisms, particularly in a number of these years. And so it became this fraudulent term where individuals would peddle medicine that in fact had no medicinal value. So it goes from a very authentic, centuries old, valid medicine to what we know it as today, which is fraudulent, if you will. Good. Okay, so ready for the next one? All right. So this phrase, often accompanied with a clapping or a snap of fingers, means hurry up. And according to the 1886 edition of Hobson Jobson in Anglo-Indian Dictionary, the phrase comes from the Cantonese word gap meaning to make haste.
Chip chop?
Yes, who said chop chop? Yes, it is chop chop. Have you all heard this phrase, chop chop? Yeah, in fact, as I was reading more about this, the derivations and as we know, language evolves, language changes, how we use language moves over time. Chop chop has really evolved or devolved, again, depending on your preference, into this sort of rude remark, right? And if you look at the history of how this has moved, often it is related to folks in more of a, for lack of a better term, sort of upper social class, directing those subordinate to them. And so you can sort of imagine this, right? Chop, chop, come on, let's get going. It's also used in the military, particularly through the middle of the 20th century, where upper ranking individuals would be directing those of lower ranks to move along, to hurry up, etc. And it seems to be, in those contexts, deemed to be universally a rude remark, a condescending remark, right? So very good. So let's move on a little bit here into this idea of language, because that's really it's sort of at the core of what we're going to be talking about. Let's kind of focus a bit more on the campus. And I think Denise is going to open up a SharePoint document. So let's just give that 1 sec for that SharePoint document to open up.
Actually, it's Google because SharePoint didn't want to play nice with me.
Sorry, Denise?
It's a Google Doc because SharePoint didn't want to play nice with me today.
Oh, okay. So it's Google Doc. Okay. I have some difficulties with SharePoint as well. So, all right, we're up on Google Doc. And so again, this is obviously our conversation today is about language. And here are some pairs of words that are to some degree, I'm sure, have some commonality in our lexicon on campus and certainly beyond campus, but we're going to focus now on campus. What do you notice about these words? What do you notice about these words? And if you want to do a hand raise or a hand emoji or some kind of, or just chat or just talk, whatever you'd like to do, but what do you notice about these pairs of words? Oh, wait, sorry, there's a chat.
Um,
So I have to put on my $1 reading glasses.
Zoe says they show dominance. Suzanne points out that they're abbreviations. Jim noted that the left is the common word and the right is the more politically correct.
Right, very good. So how do we feel about these words? Are these common in our language on campus? Do we see these today? Do we experience these today? Right, and Suzanne said not inclusive on the left. Have you experienced these words on your campus today in meetings or other interactions? Do you have an example of where this has come up, or a certain setting, interaction? Of course, not using names, etc. But I just had one the other day. Sorry, I have a lot of windows up here. The one that I hear the most is the word kids. I don't like to assume bad intent, right? I think that sometimes a word like kids isn't necessarily intended to be infantilizing or subordinating and so forth. But even if the intent isn't there, that can absolutely be the impact of the usage of that word, right? And so it becomes this sort of teachable moment, this kind of private teachable moment that we all talk about, particularly in student development. Hold on one second. What about this phrasing or this pairing, handicapped and person with a disability? What do you notice about that pairing there in particular?
The latter one puts the person first. It's person with instead of like handicapped person.
Sure. Absolutely. And that's something I suspect that we're all familiar with, this notion of person first language. So you're honoring and respecting the dignity and the value of that individual, right? And not defining them by virtue of, in this case, their disability. So let's, Denise, can they type on this, or are we typing on this, or, okay. So go ahead.
Yeah, a link in the chat, which will give you access to this document. And then you'll see that there's a second worksheet. So click on your turn, and we want you to jot down, type out whatever pairs you can think of that go beyond what we first looked at. I'll give you a minute or two to think about that and add what you come up with.
While you're typing, there was something in the chat I think is really important. An individual wrote, the last one can also be differently abled. I think that's a great point.
Be careful not to type over each other.
That's the challenge with Google Docs, right? Is that sort of initial kind of storm, if you will. And again, while you're typing, just another comment in the chat here. Joanne has noted that our campus has worked hard to move away from freshman to first year. And I think I was actually working with a student yesterday on their research paper, and the student wrote freshman, and it was a nice opportunity to have a conversation around language and how higher ed seems to be. I don't know if I'd characterize this as a movement, but certainly there are lots of examples where higher ed institutions are in fact moving away from this term freshman to first year student.
That's great. There's some good stuff here. Mark and I have a we brainstormed a list, of course, to
Mm.
kind of think about this in advance. And there's some additional points here that I think are really great. So I don't know how many of these might need a little bit of discussion here. Let's talk about that a little bit and see if there are pieces here that the folks who are on this in this meeting aren't familiar with. Let's start there, I guess, or elements that you might add. For instance, when I see athlete and student athlete, because I have a pretty extensive Division III background, I also think of scholar athlete. That's common at
Oh,
three institutions, is talk about them as scholar athletes.
interesting.
So,
That's actually really interesting. I have to say, in my years in higher ed, I've never heard that phrasing. I like that a lot. I appreciate you sharing that.
how about this plebe and new student? I don't know who shared this, but where's plebe come from? Do we think in terms of the origin?
That was me. I mean, typically it's more military,
Right.
but I actually was in a session 2 days ago with Makuho where I heard it shared for new students to describe.
Wow.
Hadn't realized it had that context, so that's why I threw it in here.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. The other piece, because it's right below Greeks and fraternity and sorority. The other piece that comes up for me often is pledge and new member, or
Mm-hmm.
pledge and associate member. That's fairly common now in terms of some shift in phrasing over time. Also related to fraternities and sororities, it's rush versus recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
Rush versus recruitment.
Or they call it the intake process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about why we think it's important to be aware of words here. And I, of course, because I'm presenting now, there is noise outside my house. So I'm going to intermittently mute myself so you don't have to hear all of that. Oh, this is just great. So why do we care about words? Why do we care about language in the first place?
I think words matter and there's meaning, but they can also hurt. And it's so the context that the sender and the receiver have can be very different.
The is perception or understanding of the word and how it might be used, as well as context, where it might be used. Okay. Other thoughts about why language matters, why we care about words and in relation to communication.
I would say words can often unite a community and give a sense of common language or common shared identity to make you feel like you're not alone, especially if it's like a marginalized identity. But at the same time, words, if not used properly, can be dividing or problematic, and also feel like you're putting someone in a box. Like when we think of like the LGBTQIA+ community, there's so much fluidity in there and so much range that it almost feels like you have to like pick an identity or be very clearly in one box or the other. So it's like it can be good or it can be bad. Language is tricky.
I really appreciate that, Amanda, because I think often, and it's my own, I'll state my own lens here, I often think of language as being potentially divisive as opposed to pulling the community together and finding ways that people can seek those commonalities and reinforce their own identity, which is part of what we're trying to talk about here today also. The two big pieces with language have to do with symbolism and internalizations. symbolism and internalization. So we recognize that language doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it depends very much on the social context. I'll choose something that is, at least for me, I know this very well, just from paying attention and listening. There are some words that I, as a white person, should not ever use, but it's okay within some communities. So it's the context that can make a difference. And just as we saw with the game show words, there are origins to them, again, and original context that goes along with them, some history. When it comes to symbolism, so thinking about what words mean in terms of images and the elements that it might either evoke or reinforce, when we have few alternative messages that are conveyed through language, we think about them in relation to symbols, and the symbols become the true, right, the quote unquote true representation of reality. So I have worked now for 3 different institutions that have Indian related mascots or names for their athletic teams. And one of them, they've since dropped the logo entirely, or the mascot that they were using for the image, but it was a warrior, and the image of the Indian, the Native American, had a large nose and a ring in the earring, earring in the ear, and a sort of a scowl on his face. And that connotes certain things, right? We believe certain things as a result of that. We then take on, here's the symbol, this must be the true meaning of that particular population, or that that word, depending on whether we're talking about a word or an image. We try, for instance, in residence life and housing, to often change people from using the word dorm, and we want them to use the word residence hall. Why do we want that? What's the symbolism that goes along with the word dorm?
I think it originated from dorm just being a place where you go to sleep, and that's mainly what you do there, whereas residence hall is where you're residing, where you experience other, interact with people, et cetera, et cetera. I think that was the original idea behind it.
All right. Joanne posted here, residence hall equals community.
I think
Sorry, go ahead.
it's okay. I think early colleges, and if you think back in like the early Harvard and stuff like that, like they would never acknowledge that learning happened outside of the classroom. So there were the dorms. They would just go back to the dorms at night to sleep, like he was saying, but like only learning can take place in the classroom back in the day. And that's when the word dorm was so used back then, and then also between dorm and barracks, used in the military a lot as well.
Right. Yeah, that's the word that comes to my mind, Chris, sometimes, is barracks. Where I think of these bunk beds in these rooms, that's a dormitory. And it comes from the French word dormir, which is to sleep. So it's a sleeping space as opposed to a living space, the way we think about it now. It's not a community, as Joanne pointed out. We often, and I've been places where it's sort of like we push that. No, don't say dorm, say residence hall. Don't say dorm. Some staff I've seen have had sort of penalty jars. If you use the word dorm, you have to put a quarter in the jar, right? There was a phrase, I used to be able to repeat all of it at one point, and it was dorm, dismal, ordinary room of mind. And residence hall, really exciting, sensational, individually designed, something, 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 learning and love, or something like that, right? We often approach that as, you should change. Here's what it is, here's what you're saying, but we want you to say this other thing, right? We want to change the symbol. We want to change the way people think about the language. But we know that residence halls, we have actual literal evidence, research evidence, that shows that living in a residence hall, living on campus, in campus housing, aids student development. It supports their learning. It provides them with some lifelong outcomes, not just contained to the college experience itself. So thinking about words and what they represent, again, whether it's an image or a word and what we connect to it, images, language has symbolism, and it's something that we carry with us. Language also leads to marginalization, right? At Bloomsburg, we used to have a program called, or for provisionally admitted students. They would come in the summer. These are students who either had a high GPA and a low SAT score or the reverse. And they'd live on campus and they would take some courses, some developmental courses. And it was to help them get up to speed, right? To provide them with some social supports, et cetera. So these students became known as summer freshmen, which then became slightly, not derogatory exactly, but if you were a summer freshman, you were not as good as people who were regularly admitted, right? So you're marginalized. Language can lead to exclusion. We use girl instead of woman. We use girl and guys. We're excluding the more mature way of thinking about the women who are on our campuses. Girl and guy, not equal terms. We don't use gal and guys, we use girl, right? That's societal, but it's also, oh my gosh, I walk around campus and talk with students and they use girl a lot, right? So it's a way of excluding a population as well. Marginalization and exclusion. Mark's going to talk a little bit about internalization of language.
Sure, and we know that often language becomes internalized in terms of our sense of self, our sense of identity, and it's especially potent when it's those repeated messages that are conveyed that we absorb either through the media, through peer groups, et cetera, that can somehow shape how we think of ourselves. However, erroneously, those messages nonetheless often land. So, for instance, words can sometimes be used to convey an inferior position, And we had some examples of that earlier. One coming immediately to mind is kids versus students, right? So, we hear the word, I hear the word a lot, quite a bit on my campus, this term kids, and it communicates that inferior position. Do you have another example of a word that can communicate that inferior positionality? Either one we've already sort of referenced on your Google Doc, or one that comes to mind, something that can communicate an inferior position. Jim put underclassmen in the chat. Absolutely. Deaf and dumb. Absolutely. There was a term. It came up somewhere. We didn't hone in on it. But what about the term non-traditional? Non-traditional student. Is this still present? This term on your campus? Yeah. And it sort of conveys a certain image, right? When you contrast that with traditional, Denise mentioned a moment ago this group of students that we used to bring into campus, summer freshmen. And often that would be contrasted with the term regular admit. And when you think about the term regular admit, in my mind, I go to what is the opposite of regular admit? Irregular admit, right? And I'm not suggesting that people were sitting around the table thinking up nefarious terms to apply to student communities, but we have to understand that these words absolutely matter and they land. And when those messages are repeated over time, and perhaps there are some thoughts and ideas and perceptions around those terms, we often can internalize those messages. And there's a number: secretary versus office associate, clerk versus administrative assistant, right? Very good. Language also conveys messages to people about their worth, to people about their value as a human being, as a person, of their worth. I like to tell stories. My students know I like to tell stories. I apologize. So I'll be very quick on this. So I'm a Bloomsburg graduate. I came to Bloomsburg in 1991. My father, who was an assistant superintendent of schools in Union County, New Jersey, he would tell me from time to time, wasn't much of a talker, but from time to time he would say he loves talking to strangers, which I always thought was sort of interesting. So we were in the bookstore, it was orientation, midsummer, we're in the bookstore. And he honed in on a student who was from New Jersey. He always liked striking up conversations with folks who had some kind of commonality, right? And her name was Mary Ellen. And so he's chatting with Mary Ellen, and I was somewhere else in the bookstore. And then I come around and I see them chatting, and he introduces me to Mary Ellen. And of course, it was that awkward kind of, okay, hi, I don't know, I no idea what to do, engage in a conversation and so forth. But we said hello and so forth. My father eventually left, and then Mary Ellen and I saw each other later that evening. There was a movie being played, Dances with Wolves, is orientation, right? 4-hour long epic there. But so Mary and Ellen and I started chatting, and she explained to me that she lost her parents, that both of her parents had passed away. And it just completely shattered my worldview, right? Because this idea that someone coming to college as an 18-year-old student didn't have access to parents, didn't have parents, was just so overwhelming to me, right? And she was explaining to me as my 18-year-old undeveloped self how hard it was in orientation to see the messages around parents, 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 parents. Every single time she saw it, it reminded her of that difficulty, that trauma. And it challenged her values, her sense of herself, her sense of worth. Is she in the right place? I don't think Bloomsburg was intending to do that, but we have to acknowledge that these words absolutely land with folks and can cause them to question their value, question their dignity, right? So media, we could probably have a whole other session, right, about media. The imagery, the language we see in the media. Anybody have an example? I got to think there's lots of examples out there, but maybe one or two that sort of speaks to this messaging piece related to language and how we can internalize those messages. Alex wrote classic Mark. Yeah, sometimes I tell stories. Sorry. Messages from the media. What comes to mind when we think about language and how that language from the media can be internalized? Thanks, Stacy.
What comes to my mind are the images that we see of beauty that until recently, those images have been almost exclusive. Well, they've been, almost exclusively of thin, white, young women. It's probably the same when it comes to men, except you get to see their six packs so that they might be buff. We don't often see, whether it's in sort of media generally or even campus publications, how often do you see someone who is differently able?
Right. On the cover.
Right. How often do you see in admissions brochures or on your website pictures of people who might not fit what we consider to be the standard college age of 18 to 22, 24, 26? Right? So there are symbol pieces there, but then the more you don't see yourself represented, that affects how you see yourself. Do you see yourself represented at a particular institution, even if you're there, even if there is a critical mass of your identity group? What does that do to you to not see yourself portrayed, to not see yourself in the faculty, to not see yourself in the staff, right? How does that affect who you are and how you see yourself?
Joanne put in the chat, there's actually a number of items in the chat. If you haven't looked at it, I would certainly encourage you to, but this one really jumped out to me: lack of interpreters at White House briefings. Joanne, that is a great point. That is a really excellent point.
we're going to let you do a little bit of, now that you know this, now that we've talked about some of these things, how might you interact with people in relation to language? So I'm putting a link to a document in the chat. You can open that up and you'll see a number of different scenarios here. Because of the number of people we have on this meeting, I'm going to create 5 breakout rooms and have you go to your room, and then in that room, discuss the scenario that matches your group number. So if you're in group 1, take a look at scenario 1. If you're in group 2, take a look at scenario 2. I'll give you about 8 minutes to do that, and then we'll come together for some larger discussion. Mark, don't join a group. I don't know what's going on with my volume, with my mic. Apparently it's crappy.
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
There were a couple moments where it sounded a little muffled,
Yeah.
but it's fine right now.
All right.
You've been sounding okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
There have
it's good to
been
be.
two things in the chat about it, so I
Mm.
sort of started to, I raised my voice a little bit. I'm working in front of my external monitor, but my laptop is up over to the side, and that's where the mic is. And I can't pull it any closer. Yeah.
The anonymous comment are mine because I don't have my name identified. So I put out the differently abled comment if you were curious who that was.
Yeah.
It's a great point. And I have to say, it's not a phrase I hear as much as we probably should hear it. So I appreciate that reminder.
Yeah, and one of my students years ago has MS, and it's one of those hidden, impairments. And so she's a very strong advocate in the differently abled community and workplace equality. So it's pretty fascinating to hear how much of an impact all of what you're all are talking about is making. It's obviously slow, just like language and culture is and evolving, but it's really awesome. I love your session.
Thanks.
The interesting piece for me, Mark and I and our grad student have been, and she's really driving us, have been working on a study of students with invisible disabilities. So everything from learning disabilities to being deaf, which is often not something that you can't see unless somebody's wearing a cochlear implant or hearing aids that are obvious, through multiple medical concerns and mental health concerns. So we're just starting to sort of take a look at those data, but we've been working on that for a little bit.
Yeah, well, even in my own house, my daughters, I have 2 daughters. My oldest is in 5th grade. She's had hearing aids since she was 6 months old. She's not deaf, but I don't even think of her as having a disability or an impairment because she can hear, but her hair covers them. But fortunately, she hasn't had any issues in school or anything, and she wears her ears like I wear my eyes, right? So it'll be really curious what as she gets older, how she continually handles it. But right now she has a lot of good confidence. I'm really hoping that her peers will maintain the dignity that they've been able to give her in elementary school.
My father had hereditary progressive hearing loss, and when he was 72, he got a cochlear implant.
Oh.
Which, I mean, at that age, that's hi. And he was an editor, right? Life of the Mind, should have been a faculty member for all his entire life, and to have them drill into your skull is a pretty scary thing. But he knew, he wanted to regain some of his hearing ability.
I don't know if you remember, if you know Erica Tardelli in the Kauai office. She's our marketing director, and her son, when he was, gosh, less than a year old, they made the decision to get a cochlear implant for him. We had that similar decision years ago, and we chose not to because her hearing wasn't completely gone. But yeah, so those are tough decisions when they're young because they can't tell you what they can and can't hear. So you rely on these, brain waves and electrical impulse measurements, which is really fascinating.
There's she may not need this at this point, mostly because most people don't have landlines. Now that I think about it, I wonder what's happening with that. So the federal government provides services for individuals with disabilities, including those who are deaf, and that includes. It used to be a tape, like if you were making a phone call, you could type in the phone call and the person in the middle, the relay person, would read it to the person that you were actually calling. Now there's something called a CAPTEL phone, CAPTEL, and you can, there's somebody who transcribes, and so you can see it on the phone. There's like a 7-second.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's like hard of hearing instead of deaf. In some cases too, but it's really interesting because last week when we had Academic Initiatives Conference, I always pronounce the university wrong, but Gallaudet or Gallaudet, that's a school for the deaf, and the live transcriptioning that you're experiencing now at the bottom of the screen hasn't rolled out completely across Zoom's enterprise. And so, luckily at University of Florida and Ohio State, which are Zoom accounts that here at Kauai that we can use for our accounts, somehow got into this pilot enterprise functionality. But I know that, Ray at Wilkes University and Johnny at WVU, they don't have it enabled yet. So I think it's slowly going to be rolling out. Lori and I were really taking a deeper dive into, can we get it for webinar? Can we get it for these other places? And it's just not widespread, but I've been watching it and it's pretty darn accurate.
It is. It's names, it kind of gets a little mixed up.
Yeah, say Kauai. Yeah, see it.
So cool. I have to say, I went to the Kauai conference a number of years ago, and the focus on people who are differently abled in terms of the opening session was great. I went to ACPA the following year, and you couldn't see the interpreter. The transcription that they had was down at the bottom. It was not up at the top, so you couldn't see. Like it was bad all the way around. And we have some people coming back. Hi. Okay, so maybe I'll call everybody back now. I'll give them a minute. Amanda, what's your baby's name?
Kaya, Kya.
Okay. And how old is she?
3 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is nice that you get to attend a conference you wouldn't normally, right?
Yeah, seriously. And I even present and everything. So that was good timing. She seems very interested in your session. She does not want to sleep. She has a very serious face.
What's the red hair, sort of? When I was younger, my hair was redder. And if I held the baby, I'd always go for my hair. Like, what is this weird color?
Yeah, she likes her dad's beard. Is a favorite. Not so much for him though. We're gonna try to put her down.
That was weird to come back to.
Maybe he's gonna try and get a little nap here. So let's talk a little bit about those scenarios and what it was like to tackle them. What was your initial reaction when you read the scenario that you were given?
So I was in group 2, and we really had a difficult time cracking into it and figuring out a context. because there were some situations where like one response would make sense and other situations where a different response would make sense. And so the context of working as an advisor with RHA, it was like, well, are we in a big meeting? Are we in a small group? Like who's there? Who's advising? And kind of all of those pieces really drove our conversation.
Okay. So you had a good discussion then about how things vary based on the particulars of the situation, the context, the people who might be involved, right? Okay. Other reactions when you first opened up and took a look at the scenario we asked you to take a look at? What were you feeling as you read this? No emotional reaction?
Hi Denise, in our group, group one, we obviously, talked about the idea of kids versus students versus scholars, right? We've been talking about that kind of this whole time, but we got into the comfortability of having that conversation with your supervisor, the correcting of that person in that position. It depends on a lot of different factors, how comfortable you are with it, age difference. We talked about different areas of campus more likely to use kids than to use students. So addressing those offices, we talked a lot about the nuances of it, as opposed to just the idea of simply saying, oh, it's actually students, not kids, So we got into like a different level of it.
Good. That's good. And I appreciate what was said earlier about trying to figure out the details of it, right? Because these are particularly, to use Alex's word, nuance. On the face of it, somebody says something that you think should be corrected potentially. Do you go ahead and just correct it? You could, but then you haven't really addressed the underlying issue. You might have corrected the word right then, but the person doesn't necessarily know why. They don't know what the concern might be with the word, right? So offering that explanation and finding the best approach given the circumstances, right? Is it your supervisor? Is it a peer? Is it a student? All of those make a difference. How about the reality of these situations happening? Does it feel real to you? Is this something that you can latch onto and think, now let me think about the situations that happen on my campus where maybe I could say something, but haven't thought to before?
I think definitely real, and then maybe a bit of guilt. Like for in group 2, the word girl, I don't know if I would have caught that or thought to correct it, depending on like context and things like that. That there's other words that I've more like honed myself into hearing to correct, like the use of gay when you really mean stupid, or like the retarded, and like using different language of like certain keywords. But I don't think I've like latched onto things like girl or boy, or maybe even kids sometimes. So like I love things like this to remind me that there's other words to like pay attention to. It's not all about policing all the time. It is about education and calling in and not out. But you need to educate yourself on where those moments need to happen.
Thank you. What are the connections for you between these situations and what we discussed earlier in terms of symbolism and internalization? What kinds of connections did you see there?
I would like to think that most of the time that, words are used, with the intent, there's not necessarily a malice intent meant by it, but I think sometimes it actually is. Like, there's been situations where, interactions with some faculty that they want to put people in their place. They want them to realize that we're the faculty, you're not. And unfortunately, that still happens to this day. Like there's still that mentality that we need to make a distinction between ourselves and other people by the words that we use. And people need to understand the role in the institution that you're a part of. And I think that, unfortunately, we've had, my last school I worked at, we had one of the higher ranking faculty members say to the vice president for student affairs that student affairs is just the hired help.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that mentality is still alive and well, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and that can be hurtful.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's insulting when words are used in that way. So there may be, maybe they're allies on your campus, like me and Mark, or Mark and I, who, wherever I can, I've sort of tried to support the staff that are those who are not faculty, in particular student affairs staff, because faculty often don't have, which is a whole other session in itself, faculty often don't have an appreciation for the work that it is that other people do. They don't see it. That's sort of an institutional fault. It's a professional fault on both sides, maybe, but it is, that's a whole other session, whole other discussion.
And words like that, it just reminded me of how sometimes words are intentionally made to feel for others to feel inferior or lesser than or subordinated. I was reminded when I heard that term of, have you ever been referred to as a babysitter in student affairs? When I worked in student affairs, I certainly heard that. And that is, there's an intent behind that that is really harmful. But it also shows that person or that group's predilection to student affairs work, the value that they play or don't, frankly, place sometimes on the work that student affairs folks engage in.
So there are some things to think about when we want someone to change their language and we want them to understand the why. We want them to understand what comes behind that it's not just a politically correct piece, which is often how this gets painted. But that to understand the assumptions underneath language, it promotes agency in the other person. It helps us to expose the language. It enables instrumentality on the part of the person who chooses to use then words, knowing what they might mean. It can empower students to take ownership of particular language one way or the other. And we might not always agree with it, right? But it can make a little bit of a difference there. Part of it, one of the ways of approaching it is to raise questions about the words, to ask if the other person understands what they mean and how language could be potentially more productive, more empowering, more inclusive. We should avoid scolding and berating, making the other person feel bad. And asking students in particular what the words mean. And Terrence will probably, if he's still in the meeting, he may remember this. We were in class and I asked the question, what does calling out his name mean? Right? What does that mean? Because I didn't know. And so I asked students about that before I chose to use that phrase or to think of it as something that was necessarily a negative approach, right? So you can ask students what words mean. I also think it's important, which I had trouble with earlier on in my career, that it's important that we not try to squelch speech and language by trying to correct it, that we don't shut people down, right? My little, oh no, don't say dorm, dismal ordinary room of mine, like that didn't get anybody anywhere. I probably looked really stupid, but it didn't change the other person's approach because it didn't help them. It just made them maybe shut up around me, which is not good for the way they think of themselves. Our role as educators is to educate. And I think keeping that front and center is very helpful when we think about language. We are definitely at time. So, Mark, I don't know if you want to share just a little bit of maybe some positive words about possible implications for practice.
Yeah, I think, these teachable moments that the scenarios kind of evoked perhaps for some, I think part of the question that we have to ask ourselves is this nuance, is this context? When is the right time? When is the appropriate time? Sometimes we had a really great discussion in class the other day, this idea of praising in public and criticizing in private, but we were revisiting that idea And is that always in every single situation, the right way to go? I'm thinking about a scenario where if the comment or the term isn't addressed in a way that's educational, of course, might there have been a missed opportunity, and perhaps somebody in the audience or the group leaves feeling slighted or feeling hurt, and so forth. And these are tricky things to navigate, certainly, but we are all educators, right? That is the core sort of essence of many of our identities, regardless of whether you work in student affairs or on the faculty in the faculty realm. So I think keeping that mission in mind and embracing these as teachable opportunities, which I know is a bit cliche, but embracing these as teachable opportunities can really guide what we do here moving forward.
I put our contact information up in Zoom. I'm sorry, on the PowerPoint slide is up there, and I put the evaluation link in the chat. You can also use the QR code on the PowerPoint slide to be able to provide us with some feedback. This is one of those sessions that we like to evolve. This is sort of our first pass at it, but any feedback that you have and ways that we can improve this are greatly appreciated. And we really appreciate your interaction and the discussion and conversations that you've made, both verbally in the group rooms and through chat. So thank you very much.
Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yes.